Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Steinberg Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at the mixer architecture in Halion 7. So that includes all the routing options available to us, but also we're going to have an examination of insert and auxiliary effects. Hope you're enjoying the series so far. If you are, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. I'm going to start off nice and simple today. Here's our init analog synth program, and I've opened the mixer section. Let's have a quick overview at a very high level of the mixer architecture in Halion. We have output channels. We have up to 32 output channels, but by default only one of them is engaged. If we have a look at the out section, you can see that this program is currently routed to the master output. That's also reflected in the slot view. When we have a look, we have 32 output channels in Halion. Only the master channel is currently in use. We can engage additional outputs from the Activate Output screen inside Cubase, and there's access to the other 31 of them. But for the most part, when I'm designing sounds in Halion, I generally work on a one instance to one slot basis. I don't use my keyboard as a performance instrument, for instance, where I'd split the keyboard and output to different slots. In that particular case, then you would be interested in using multiple sounds. As a very quick example, because it's not something that I use, so I'm not going to talk in great detail about it, but I'll load up a second program into slot number 2 now. You can see that they're both outputting to the master output. I could, of course, route them to different output destinations. When we jump over to our slots tab, now that I've added Ghost Buzz, that appears as a second strip in this view. But for the most part, and for the examples I'm going to show you today, we're only ever going to have one entry in the output section and one entry in the slot section. I'm primarily interested in everything below that level, in other words, at the program level. So in order for us to get onto the most interesting stuff as quickly as possible, I'm going to throw this second program away, get us back to a single slot, single instance. As you can see, the interface is now updated. When we look at the program tree, we can see the routing for this program. So all of your routing options, your buses, are in blue, and you can see in this program we have 2 buses. We have a layer bus called analog synth bus, and we also have a master bus for the program called program bus. So let's try to tally up this program tree with what we see in the mixer. The child tab shows you everything at and below your currently selected level. I have the program level selected, so here's the program bus, but also we can see the analog synth bus. It's been abbreviated because this is below, the analog synth layer is below the program. When we click the Depend tab, we see everything at and above the current context. So here's our program bus again, because that's visible in both views. But now we're seeing the world above the program. Here's our slot, here's our master output. Almost every channel strip in Halion is identical. The only real exception is the master output that doesn't have a routable output configuration. Master is the master. It's going to get to the outside world. There's nothing you can do about it. And so you see, you don't have an output routing. That said, everything else is identical. At the moment, it looks like one slot is bigger than the others, but it really isn't. I just happen to have the program selected at the moment. If I select the analog synth bus, now that's going to be the biggest visible channel strip, and everything else has shrunk. The reason we're getting this kind of context-based view is a user interface option up at the top. We have this auto expand selected mixer channel. If I disengage that, now when I toggle back to the program view, it's not auto expanding the program view. I can't see why I would ever want to disengage that function. Leave auto expand on, it's really good. If you want to see all of the options for all of the channel strips simultaneously, you can click expand all mixer channels, and it's going to give you that view. Just bear in mind that the moment you click away and go somewhere else, you're going to head back to your default auto expand function. And the options inside the mixer bus are so trivial, they're barely even worth mentioning. Mute, solo, pan, level control, really straightforward stuff. But at this point, what I want to do is load up a program that has a more complex routing option so that we can see some of this stuff pre-populated rather than me having to build it all from scratch. That's not really going to get us anywhere. I'm going to head over to the media bay, and I'm going to load Ghost Rider 130. It's in the HS3 combis folder. If you have access to that, let's load that up. And this is a very rich preset. It sounds like this. So I'm just pressing a single key here. We have a rhythm, we have multiple different anima layers going on in the background. We're going to have a look at the mixing and routing options in this preset today, pull it to bits and figure out how the mixer works. Let's head over back to our program tree. Now, a nice way to view this preset is to expand the entire tree. The master section has a lot of samples which we don't really care about. So if you right click on master, collapse, and then reopen it, all of the subfolders inside, but we're going to want to have a look at these green sections below. So this is a nice view to have. Let's just take a moment to get to terms with the layers in this preset. We have an animal layer with that sound. Then we have a beatbox generating the rhythm. We have a second animal layer creating a sequenced effect. And then there's a second sequence at a higher frequency. So 3 animal layers, 1 beatbox. I select the program at the top of the view and we have a look at the depend perspective. You can see here's the program that's always visible when you've selected on the main program. Here's the slot, Ghost Rider 130. Here's our master channel, again, always there. And we've got a new entry, auxiliary FX1. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Over in the child view, quite a lot more going on here. Again, the program bus always there. Now we can see our 3 anima buses, all called the same, which isn't particularly helpful, but it doesn't matter from today's perspective. 3 different anima layers. Here's the beatbox layer. And we also have 2 auxiliary sends. We have a delay and a reverb inside the beatbox. Here they are. Furthermore, if we expand all of the mixer channels, you can see that we have a host of effects being added to some of these buses. Now, I need to be very careful how I describe these effects because ordinarily when you see 8 slots like this, you're going to think, oh, they're insert effects. And as you're looking across, you see limiters and EQs and compressors and all of the kind of stuff you would expect to be on insert slots. But they're actually multifunctional because these slots also double as send effect slots. Auxiliary FX1 is a good example. You can see it in multiple of the different buses. In fact, every primary layer bus in this preset is sending some signal to auxiliary FX1. We're going to have to figure out how all of that works. So it's easy to be caught out by this when you first look at these slots. Don't make the mistake of thinking that they're insert effects. They're not. They're multifunctional FX slots capable of taking inserts or sends. So let's home in on one of these layers and have a little bit more of a closer look at that. So I've soloed the first anima bus. Now if I select that program, we've zoomed into just this view. Here are the 3 effects that we saw when we were also looking at it from the program perspective. I can still jump up to the program perspective and I'm going to see it with all of the other fluff wrapped around. I just thought I'd kind of narrow it down to exactly what we're interested in. If I select any of these individual effects, I just clicked on the studio EQ there. Now we get the options for that. I'm not going to go through individual effects units today. We're talking about routing considerations, but obviously this is an EQ. Here's our multi-delay. Now, as you can see, it's currently set to 0, but we also have a quick control that allows us to dial this in. So if I basically turn up the delay, there it is, and back down again. Or I can obviously affect that directly from within the effect itself, and back down. So let's tally up what we're seeing in the mixer view with the program tree. So here we are selected on the anima layer, and when we drill in, we can see the anima bus. When we open that tab, here are the 3 effects corresponding to the effects over here. If I added a 4th, let's add the tape saturator, now it's going to appear. So this is basically like a view-only perspective. You don't really want to directly interact with the settings over here. You can. I can right-click to delete to take them away from this perspective. But primarily, this is basically telling you what effects you have on any individual layer or program. So layers and programs are the things that can have buses attached to them. Zones can't. Just to the right of each of the insert effects, we have a bypass button. Press that and it's going to disengage the effect. Bring it back. Insert effects are pretty much straightforward, so we'll leave it there. This anima bus layer needs to get somewhere else. It needs to ultimately get to the outside world. How is it going to do that? Well, this very innocuous looking double dash is your output destination, and double dash simply means default. If we open up the output options and drill in into the Anima subfolder, here's the program name, there's the program bus. That's where it's actually going. If I explicitly set it to the program bus, I would be having no effect on the program. It's effectively, that's where it's going. So layers always by default propagate to their next highest level, but I can actually completely circumvent that routing if I want. I could direct it straight to the master output, and then this Anima layer would ignore any other mixing options inside the rest of the program. Okay, all pretty straightforward so far. Right, it's finally time for us to start talking about auxiliary effects, because this is a little bit more confusing. There are 4 primary auxiliary effects sends in Halion, and they live at the slot level. In other words, they live above the entire program. Every layer in this particular preset is currently outputting to the first of those 4 available buses, auxiliary FX1. So we still have this Anima layer soloed here, so this is the only thing we can currently hear. I'll just press the key again. There's the sound. And as you can see, the output is going up to the program and then off to the outside world. Let's set the level to 0, so now when I press a key, you don't hear any noise. But there is a second alternate route that we can take to get this sound to the outside world. We can go via this auxiliary bus. Let's jump over to the auxiliary tab. Here you can see the 4 auxiliary sends that are set up, like I say, above the program level. Every layer in this program has access to these auxiliary sends. A quick point to note about these auxiliary sends before we move on. They actually live entirely outside the program. So if I make any changes to these auxiliary buses and load a new program into Halion, the changes that I've made to the auxiliary bus will survive. They're actually above the concept of the media bay. So just bear this in mind if you make changes to the auxiliary sends. You could inadvertently carry this over into the next program that you load. Anyway, here's auxiliary FX1. And when I press a key on the keyboard, there's no activity whatsoever from the mixer's perspective. Let's jump back over to the Anima bus view. What I'm going to do now is route some signal from this Anima bus layer up to that auxiliary send. Now I've turned my level all the way down to 0, so that's ordinarily going to cause a bit of a problem. But send effects can be pre-fader. Underneath any send effect, you actually have 2 split functions. On the left hand side, if I hover over it, you see it says pre-fader send. If I engage that and then turn up my send level, there it is. So I've basically circumvented the standard program routing, and I'm now sending a signal from this Anima bus via my auxiliary send, which is pre-fader, so it doesn't care where the mixer channel is set to. And this is now my master send level. Now every layer in this program has access to this auxiliary send. By default, you can see that they're all routed to it. So I'll show you a couple of examples of the kind of thing that we can accomplish with these alternate routing mechanisms. What it's probably best for me to do actually is reload the program so we get back to completely default. I'll have a quick look at my auxiliary channels to make sure that everything's still good over there. And now with my main program selected, I head over to my child view. I get to see all of my layers simultaneously. If I open them all up, now I can see all of my different auxiliary sends. Let's make this as big as we can. There we go. So I can now see all 4 layers and all 4 auxiliary sends simultaneously. And we're going to have a bit of a play with this auxiliary send channel so that I can give you an idea of the kind of things available to you. Just before we start though, have a look at the various pre and post fader options. The beatbox, which is the rhythm, is pre-fader, which means no matter how loud this channel is set in the mixer, I've always got the option to send it to the auxiliary bus. Let's just do that actually before we go any further. Get the sound going. Turn the rhythm down. Gone. Now turn the rhythm back up via the auxiliary send. Why might I want to do that? Well, we can put effects on the auxiliary send bus. Let's put an amplifier in. Now we've changed the tone of the rhythm. So now we've got 2 alternate different rhythm sounds. There's our main one. Sorry, that was auxiliary FX, wasn't it? This is the main sound. And back to the amplified sound using this amp modeler. But of course, we can route any of the sounds to that channel. Let's jump back over to the child tab, re-expand them again. And now the three animal layers, here they all have their pre-routed auxiliary send. And so we can send that alternate sound in any mix that we want. So this is the beauty of auxiliary sends, very commonly used for things like delay and reverb, where you'll set up one primary sound that lots of different layers, channels, programs, whatever you want, might want to feed into, and then you can basically salt to taste by choosing how much of that thing that you send in. The send level is completely independent from the primary output level, except that if it's a post fader, it is subservient to the primary output level. So a post fader sends as much signal as it can, as determined by the overall volume. A pre-fader sends exactly this much and doesn't care about the channel strip's independent volume. Just to prove that the auxiliary buses are at the slot level and not the program level, here's the sound again. Turn the main program output down and we still have sound, because all of those routings, all of this extra stuff that I'm routing to the auxiliary FX, I didn't do anything with the individual layers volumes. I turned down the entire program, but you're still hearing it because this secondary route is bypassing the program and going directly to the auxiliary outputs. Another advantage of auxiliary sends is that they're accessible from within the zone. Let's carry on picking on this first anima sound. I'm going to select its zone and head over to the Edit tab. Now, when we had a look at the amplifier section earlier in this tutorial series, I basically swept over the auxiliary controls because we weren't ready to talk about them at that point, but now we are. So now all of these auxiliary sends, each one of these 4 auxiliary channels is available to every zone in the program implicitly. We don't have to do anything. All I need to do is turn up auxiliary send, and now this zone is sending its signal directly, a second copy effectively of that audio signal being generated by the zone is being sent to the auxiliary send. There's quite a cool interface shortcut here as well. Let's turn up auxiliaries 2 and 3 as well and head back over to the mixer. Now, what does this layer look like from the mixer perspective? If we have a look at its dependencies, you can see auxiliaries 1, 2 and 3 are now enabled. The layer is depending on these auxiliaries to paint its full picture. It can't tell the full story of the sound that it's making without you being able to see these auxiliary channels. So these auxiliary send levels here are the primary output levels. If I turn down FX2, for instance, let's set it to -20, jump back over to the auxiliary tab. This is the slider that I just affected. So you're being given like a quick view into the auxiliary sends that you need to be able to understand what these things are doing, because the anima zone is now sending to them. I solo this sound, get it going again, and turn all the 3 auxiliaries down. There's no longer a route out. I've already disabled the program bus. I did that a little bit earlier. Now I've turned down all the auxiliary effects. And there they all are. And if we listen to FX1, that's the one with the amplifier still on, and that's why it sounds a little bit weird. So again, let's just deal with like really simple use cases. Let's put a super simple delay on auxiliary 2, and let's put some reverb on auxiliary 3. And now there's our amplifier. Just let go of the key to prove that there's the delay. And there's my reverb. Like I say, delay and reverb are by far the 2 most common effects you'll see on auxiliary buses. Now, every single zone inside this entire program has direct access to a delay and a reverb, a master delay and reverb if I want to, and I can basically salt to taste Ordinarily, what you'll see happen with auxiliary channels is that they're not set to any ridiculous value. I usually set all of my auxiliary sends to exactly 0 and determine how much signal I'm going to send to them from the source, not the destination. This is where I decide how much delay or reverb or amplifier is going to be applied to this sound. Now, that's not your only option for auxiliary sends, because you can have local auxiliary sends as well, and these exist within a single layer. I think I'd better reload my Ghost Rider program, get everything nice and clean again, just make sure that my auxiliaries are okay, and we'll re-expand this layer once more. These two entries in the beatbox layer, entitled Delay Return and Reverb Return, are examples of local auxiliary sends. So your 4 primary auxiliary sends, they're called auxiliary FX1, 2, 3, and 4. You can actually rename these to whatever you want, but that's their default name. They're there all the time. You don't have to create them. You can't create them. You can't do anything with them. Local auxiliary sends are optional and need to be added. So whichever layer that you're interested in, at the moment I've selected the master layer, this has the potential to have up to 4 independent auxiliary sends for its own layer. If we click the Create New Bus button in the top toolbar, you can see that 1 and 2 are already grayed out. Those auxiliary sends have already been created. They can't be recreated. But if I choose auxiliary bus 3, now I have a 3rd auxiliary send. And if I jump over to the child view, there it is. So I could now add, I don't know, let's say a phaser to auxiliary send 3. And that's now set up, ready to go. Let's have a quick look at the delay and reverb returns. So here's our delay return with a multi-delay added to it. Here's our reverb with the reverb unit added to them. And can you see that they're both set to 0? So by default, these auxiliary channels are not active. I'm going to solo the beatbox. Here's the sound. Now I'll turn the delay return up. Pretty obviously a delay going on there. So let's figure out how that routing works. How are we getting information to this local auxiliary send? This is a good illustration of the use case for setting an auxiliary send at 0 by default and pre-configuring your zones. So each of the kicks have an auxiliary send of so much. But if we have a look at the snares, they've actually got a different amount being fed into the auxiliary send. So all of these sounds have been pre-configured, every one of these zones, to determine how much signal is going to get sent to the delay auxiliary send when we're interested in hearing it. So all of these zones, and you can see just how many different sounds we have here, they're all individually configured so that they send an amount of delay to the auxiliary send. But when we were looking at these 4 controls earlier, we thought we were looking at the master auxiliary sends, in other words, the primary slot level auxiliary sends. Well, that's true unless they're overridden. So if you create local auxiliary sends, that basically overrides the default. And now these controls inside the zone are going to route directly to these local controls. Remember, the double dash means by default. If you have a look in the output, here's the default return. This is your local auxiliary send 1. You still have the option to override it. If you really want to go directly to the slot auxiliary send 1, you can, but that's not the default. It's being overridden the moment we create these local auxiliaries. So now auxiliaries 1 and 2 have been configured for all of these different drum sounds in an amount that's appropriate for a balanced drum set. That entire signal is then fed into the delay return, which we see here, and that's turned down until we want it. So this control here is actually operating the opposite way round than an auxiliary send normally would. This is kind of like a throw, you know, you leave it off for the most part, and then on that like dramatic hit, you might suddenly increase this thing, and the entire drum kit, which is pre-configured to send a signal into this auxiliary send. Same for the reverb. Have a look at that. By default, it's at 0. When I turn the reverb up, all of those individually pre-configured volumes are being sent down this like secondary routing channel. If you have a big enough monitor, you can see that any bus that's represented in the program tree actually has a number corresponding to its ordinal position. So local auxiliary buses are labelled 1, 2, 3 or 4. There's a 1, a 2, a 3. And then the master auxiliary buses are red. So here's auxiliary 1 down below. Let's have a look at how we can access these local auxiliaries. So if I select the parent layer, which is called master, and we have a look at the dependencies, here are both the delay and the reverb. You can kind of view auxiliary sends as being at a peer-to-peer level in many ways, because here we're looking at the dependency tab and we can see the auxiliary sends from the dependency perspective, but if we switch over to the child perspective as well, they're also visible there. So it's this at or below, at or above kind of concept. Finally, in terms of manipulating the effects themselves, let's just get something that has multiple different options on. I'm going to pick up this compressor. I can move it to a different slot. I can either drop it directly into a slot, or I can move it in between two existing spaces. If I hold the Alt key down, pick up the compressor, I'm going to be duplicating it, and now I could perhaps create a second compressor and do some sort of double compression options. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.